Well, hello everyone. Daphne,
Feelings.
how you feeling today?
I'm feeling just great. I had a sort of a moment of like, what was I feeling? I don't know. Actually, I'm feeling very excited, but it took me a second, as it can,
I
just
am
to know what we're
feeling
feeling.
super elevated today.
Yes, I
I
am
just
too.
got back from an incredible life-giving walk in the sunshine and beautiful springtime weather with fresh, crisp air. And it
I love
has
it.
boosted my mood, if you will.
Yeah, as it can. I am currently at our house in Michigan. So different background you noticed this morning. And I feel also the sun and the light changes in the spring, as we come into summer. So the light kind of shifts and I just love that. It is definitely a mood elevator for me. However, so important, Cliff, I'm not entirely dependent on what the weather does for feeling great.
I
But we're
love
going
that.
to
And
talk about that
we're going to talk
today.
about that today.
Yes.
Feelings. Here we go.
Welcome to Life, the ultimate choose your own adventure game with hosts Cliff Ravenscraft and Daphne Scott. Join this dynamic duo as they explore the profound concept of life as a thrilling adventure, blending ancient wisdom and modern psychology. Embrace the joy of living with presence, creativity, and playfulness. It's time to navigate the game of life together. Are you ready to play? Let the adventure begin.
Today I'm living with presence. I got that one out of it today.
Oh my gosh, so did I.
Is that the same one?
Yes, that is so
Wow.
funny. I was like, "Oh, I can't wait to see that embrace living your life in presence," or whatever exact words are. Yeah, that's
Whatever it
exactly
said.
what yeah, whatever it said. Something about presence.
So, Daphne, tell us why the topic of feelings today.
Yeah, okay. So, we did our show last week, and typically, I don't listen to our shows in their entirety. I'm doing the show notes and that sort of thing, but I recognized about, I don't know, towards the end of last week's show or something, we were talking about making a request. And, Cliff, this is where we hold these sort of two things. Like we know our past experience of how we related to life, and we know our experience now as we've done a lot of our own work and our consciousness and all the different tools and things that we've done. And I spoke about, yes, there is absolutely the ultimate, what I would call the ultimate truth of things. And then there's sort of this conventional truth that we live in, right? This truth of being human. And I revealed that how I found myself skipping over making a request, what I felt or what I needed at a time by getting really high minded about it. And so which we would call spiritual bypassing. And we'll talk about that on the show today. But I was sitting with that a little bit and I'm like, gosh, we really haven't talked about feelings and what we mean by feelings and what they are, why we should even care. And what I recognized last week when I was talking was that that's what I was talking about, like how I would skip over feelings, thoughts, needs that I would have and try to go into this other space of being really high-minded about it and just saying like it's all good, sort of that sort of throwaway kind of approach. So I thought it would be really helpful today if we talked a little bit about feelings and how to work with them. And I know we're going to have a lot to talk about on this episode because there's also the truth, and I think you would um I think this is just sort of the path. There's also the truth that we have a lot of influence about how we feel and what we can do with our emotional energy. And I see emotions as a form of energy. So there's just a lot. I think it's just so helpful to talk about it. So that's how I got to the idea, Cliff.
Well, I love it. I'm excited because this is the first time I've had a conversation with somebody at this level about our emotional state where we can, how much do we have control over? How much of it is outside of our control? How do
Yes.
we process that? What's the difference between emotions and thoughts? And
Yes.
what kind of loops can we get ourselves into? So I'm excited for this. Where do you want to
Yes.
begin?
Well, let's start with probably let's just define what we mean by the word feeling. And this is a distinction that I learned at one point in my life and it was groundbreaking. Earth-shattering actually. First of all, let me say a feeling and a thought are not the same thing.
Mhm.
Okay, so a feeling comes with now, and we label them, so we'll get to that. But a feeling is really a set of sensations occurring in and on the body. That is a feeling. So if I said to you, for example, I may say to you, Cliff, wow, I feel nervous. So I've labeled an experience that I'm having. But if I come back to my body, for me, nervousness shows up as maybe what we would describe as like a feeling in my stomach, maybe like kind of the butterfly things, or I might notice that my hands feel a little sweaty. But there are body sensations that come with a feeling. Now, it may also be true that I have a thought. This is where you and I spend a lot of time. I have a thought that um, this thing that we're doing is going to go horribly.
Right.
Right. So there's a thought, and we'll talk about the cognitive emotional loop here in a second, but there's a thought that can come with it. But I want to be really clear that the thought is not the feeling. A
Right.
feeling has a set of sensations in on the body, and then we label it so that we can um relate to each other probably a little bit more. Like if I say I'm nervous, I could just say to you, Cliff, as we're sitting here, I notice I have this tightness in my stomach, and I have sweaty hands, and I could just leave it. Right, you'd be like, okay, good for you. Good job.
So the way that I think about this, first and foremost, I love that you came up with the title and that it's got feelings, because feelings is not a word that I use very often. I can't remember the last time prior to seeing the outline for our discussion today, the last time I even saw the word feelings in anything that I was getting ready to participate in some sort of thought process or dialogue.
Okay.
I I Instead, for me, I always think of emotional states.
Yes.
So for me,
Yes.
when I think about a feeling, I've never really labeled it. I have this feeling. I have an emotional state. So in one of the ways that I've learned to describe emotions, and I think you just said it, energy in motion. There's
Mhm.
some sort of energy in motion inside of my body. And yes, there is a sense of it. There is a feeling of it. I feel that energy that is different than, let's just say, the default nature of what do you call that? The When you acclimate to your normal rhythm and place.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like when you're like a habitual part of you, or just your baseline.
my baseline. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
I'm out
Okay.
of my baseline.
Yeah.
So I noticed that the energy is
So
off
good.
from my baseline. And by the
Yeah.
way, my baseline used to be very negative emotions such as fear, anxiety, shame, guilt.
This
The
is so good.
Yeah,
Okay. I just need to grab this part because when you said emotional state, I mean, Cliff, this is really what we're talking about. So in emotion, if we can get with that, an emotion or a feeling, sensations in and on the body, that's why I like to just get it really granular. Those will actually move through us relatively quickly,
yeah,
30 to 60 seconds. When this is the whole essence of why when we can allow them to do so. Now, when you say it becomes an emotional state, let's use sadness as an example. If I start to experience something that I would label as sadness, and I am unwilling, incapable, I'm resisting it, that wave can no longer move through me, and it becomes a state. It
yeah.
become Right? It becomes fixed. I think it's so great that you talk about it that way, because I would be willing to bet that a majority of us have had that exact experience where we just sort of seem like we're stuck in this place and the energy isn't moving. And that's really one of the most important things that I wanted to talk about today, because I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think that that's really where um the downside of not being able to work with our emotional states or feelings, however we want to talk about it, really where that starts to live. Yeah.
So in preparation for this, one of the things that gave me as distinctions as I was researching different variations of how to look at this.
Yeah.
It was talking about emotions, then there are states. I'm sorry, there are emotions, then there are thoughts, and then there are moods.
Yeah.
So an
Yeah.
emotion is that temporary sensation, that the energy that's flowing through the body. Then there's a thought, and we can get into
Yes.
the cognitive loop in just a few moments. But if we continue to see that loop stay in place, then we can get stuck in a mood. We've
Yes.
defined a mood, and that's what you're saying, and or we're in a state.
Yep.
And ironically, some language that I used to come up with, and this may jump ahead, and we'll unpack it a little later, perhaps if it comes up. But I used to say things like, "I am so worried right now. I am so angry. I am
Yeah.
so whatever." So let's just stick with angry right now.
Yeah.
I am so angry. And when I said I am angry, what I'm doing is I'm identifying my
Yes.
consciousness with this mood, with this state. And that means that I'm literally concentrated on a situation, a circumstance, the feeling of the emotion inside of my body, and then the thoughts that that contain the meaning and the catastrophizing of what this could possibly go, how this bad this could possibly go. And then
Yes.
that leads to more energy in motion or emotions. And eventually I'm like, I am angry. This is who I am. And I have people who have come to me and says, Cliff, I'm just an angry person. And so one of the things that has been very helpful for me, and tell me if you think this borderline spiritual bypassing, but
Yeah.
here's what I have learned to do.
Okay.
Instead of me giving myself a, I am so angry right now. Instead, I've learned to sense it, to feel it,
Hmm.
and then to say, "Wow, I am aware that there are feelings of anger within me, and there
Yes.
are thoughts of catastrophe in my future, and I feel I'm aware of thoughts that I feel violated, disrespected, and I'm just aware of all of this, and it's creating some ball of energy that is very discomforting inside of my physical being." And
Yes.
so instead of saying, I am angry, I am aware that anger is occurring within my physical being. That's
Yes.
something that I've learned to develop over time.
Well, it's critical. And I mean, I'm going to go one path and then another path. Well, they'll kind of flow into each other. So, one thing that you're describing, Cliff, that's so important is how we talk about our feelings and how we talk about this experience, what I would say the experience of emotion. So when we start using I am language, it does a couple things. And this is one of the reasons I think we can get stuck in some of it. So it gives us an identity.
Yep.
I am angry. I am anger. And it's really kind of fun to say it that way, even I am anger. I think if people said that, you're like, are you? Like, I don't know anybody that would say that. But yet when we say I am angry, that's okay. But I would never walk around saying I am anger.
I am Groot.
I am I am. So, we wouldn't do that, right? Like I am, all these sorts of things. So it gives an identity. And so I think it's very important what you just described because our languaging and how we talk to ourselves really matters. It does.
It
So,
does, especially, and I know you wanna go on, but I just wanna say
yeah,
it matters because for me, there have been conditioned thoughts from society about things that are acceptable and not acceptable. It's like,
which we're going to talk
when I
about.
when I was a kid, it's like, "Listen, don't be angry, go and
Yes.
forgive right now, get that
Yes.
stop crying right now," and
I'm going to give you something to cry about.
yeah.
Thanks.
And so for me, there are some things that seem to be less socially acceptable, such as
Sure.
an angry person, a depressed person, a person who experiences guilt. And quite frankly, it seems that even sometimes when somebody's going through grieving after a loss, sometimes somebody who is experiencing grief can be there seems to be some discomfort among others not knowing how to deal with a person, to be in the presence of someone
Yes.
with guilt, or I'm sorry, with grief. And so when we get into these lower levels of consciousness, that not lower in that they're more bad, but there seems to be some, for me, what I learned, there was some unconscious connection that was made throughout my childhood that seemed to say that if you feel guilt and shame and depression and you're grieved and you're anxious and worried and you're prideful and all this other stuff,
Mhm.
those are all negative, and you should and it's funny, you should feel ashamed of yourself.
You should feel ashamed of yourself for having any shame. Yeah, exactly. So I want to definitely parking lot that, because this is a lot of how we learn and are taught to not be with feelings and emotions,
Yep.
and how we're bad for them arising, which we're going to talk about as well. So, which they do simply arise.
Yeah.
So we will get to that. So yeah, I mean, so you're talking about how we talk to ourselves about it. I am this versus I am experiencing. And I want to say why this is even more important, because they will move through us if we can allow that to be such. So that was the first thing, right? As soon as you say I am, it implies this fixed entity, of which we are not ever fixed about anything. So nothing is permanent, and we aren't either. So in that way. So the energy can move. So that's the first thing that you were talking about. And I think it's very important how we talk to ourselves. So I am experiencing something that I would label for myself as anger, right? And here are the sensations that I'm experiencing, right? When I experience anger, typically my ears get hot, which is really awesome. Sometimes they turn red, like
Yep.
the Tasmanian devil, and I'll get heat in my shoulders, typically my neck. Every once in a while, if I'm angry enough, I can feel it sort of in my jaw, on both sides. So, getting in touch with our body signals, like what comes through our body, can be so helpful. Now, the other thread I wanted to pull here, and I think this is really sort of starts to loosen some of the grip that some of the stories were told. So, have you ever experienced an elevated heart rate? Like where your
Oh,
heart
yeah.
is beating faster? Okay. And have you ever experienced like where you're sort of sweaty?
Not as much the sweatiness, except for in the palms of my hands.
Okay. Okay. Your palms will get sweaty, but you've experienced sweatiness,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Me too. Like when I'm running.
Oh, yeah, when I'm at the gym, heck yeah, I'm
Exactly.
drenched wet. All of my
Right.
clothes are like I could literally wring out the sweat if I get a good gym workout in.
Exactly. So this is going to go, I'm pointing now to the cognitive emotional loop.
Okay.
There are absolutely times when my heart is racing, my hands are sweaty, there's heat on my neck, and I could be running down the street getting my workout in. I
Yep.
also can experience those same set of sensations if I hear something that I don't like. If somebody says something to me. What's interesting is that those exact physical manifestations are the same.
Yes.
But the stories and the thoughts I have about those manifestations is what starts to create the rub. So, in one instance, I'm willing to accept an elevated heart rate, my heart pounding faster, and the sweatiness on my hands and my neck because I'm running. And I've decided that that's okay to experience those sensations when I'm running. I decided that if someone says something or something happens that I don't like and I experience those sensations, that's not okay.
Yeah,
And I might label those sensations as anger.
exactly.
So,
Also, something completely off topic is the fact that I've learned that there are some emotional states that are in our body that present themselves with the same physiology,
yes,
but so we can give them different language based upon our thoughts. So,
yes,
for example, I used to think I was worried and anxious and had tons of fear a lot. When in reality, what I was doing is I was often going after new things that I didn't know how to do. There were unique challenges. And quite frankly, I had such a deep level of anticipation and
excitement.
excitement
Yes.
that but physically it felt like fear. It felt and showed up in my body exactly the same way, and I labeled my excitement as fear and then gave it thoughts to support it, and my actual excitement turned to fear.
Exactly. Fritz Perls, who was a psychologist way, way back in the day, he used to say, fear is just excitement without the breath.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yes.
I love that statement. Yes. And actually this happens quite a bit. We call them jacket emotions. So let's get on the thread of where we've been taught that certain things are acceptable and certain things aren't. God help us if we talk about sexual feelings.
Oh, goodness.
Yee. Whoa, can't talk about those ever, right? You mentioned guilt and shame. I'm like, bring up sexual feelings. People will run for the door. So, when we talk about things that we've been taught that are acceptable, if I'm a woman and I get really mad, I will be given certain labels
Mm.
by other people, right? I will be called the B word. I will all kinds of things, right? So what women, as an example, some women learn, not all, but some women learn that it's not okay to be angry. So instead, they will cry.
Mm.
Oh, because that expression is somewhat more acceptable than the expression that might come forth with anger or frustration.
And isn't it interesting that men seem to be taught it is
Yes.
you're shunned for being overly emotional and too sensitive, and why are you crying? And men are like, dude, be a man, get up there, get angry and make something happen.
Yeah, man up. I mean, we even say it, man up.
Yes.
I mean, yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So you're not allowed as a man to have water come out of your eyes,
Yep.
right? Or I think even worse for men, in my opinion, this is completely my opinion. God help you if you're scared.
Mm.
I mean, and so I think the jacket emotion does become anger, right? So it's just more acceptable for men to look angry than it is for them to admit that they're scared, right? Women probably can get away with that a little bit more. So we've been taught just these certain sorts of ways. My take home point is this, regardless of my opinions. My take home point is that we all have different things that we have been taught that are okay to feel and that are not. And that's really the take home message. So, if you've received that message in the past, and I think you and I would both say that we have, I definitely have. It was not okay for me to feel sad. And it took me years, years to learn to be sad. Everyone's like, you're so enthusiastic. I'm like, yeah, I cannot feel anything else. It was not very helpful. It was helpful. It was okay until it wasn't. And so, learning how to be with the experience of sadness. So we've all gotten sort of these messages through wherever that it's not okay to feel certain things. And then that really kinks the hose. And I think this is the part that I really wanted to drive home. It's like they all flow through the same pipe, if you will, through the same hose. So any place that you're kinked with one of them, your energy, your vitality will be kinked. You won't have the full, yeah, just vitality that you can have when you can learn to be with these experiences in a healthy way, I would say, right? And then the energy can flow. And I think that's really what and the language really matters. And I know we're going to get to this, but that's really what I wanted to land on today. And then how do we do that? How do we work with in the States? And I know you've done a lot of work with this too, Cliff. How do we work with these things? How do we shift a state? Is it okay to shift our state? What does it mean to work with and feel sadness, and then to know that we don't have to, quote, be stuck in that state, right? And how do we work with that? So that's really, I think, the getting to the how of this. And then our thoughts feeding into this cognitive emotional loop that we keep replaying, right? The story. And we've done a lot of conversations around that on our shows already, but we keep replaying the story, which can keep the emotions going. And that's a question that I often get asked from people like, well, is it, what comes first, my feeling or my story? And my answer to that is it doesn't matter. Just right. If you can recognize that you're having both, you are light years, light years ahead of where you need to be at this point, right? If you can recognize that. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that.
I love that. So a couple of things that come up for me. First and foremost, I by the way, I have an opinion. I don't know if I'm right, but I have an
Yeah.
opinion on what comes first. Is it the chicken or the egg, or
Yeah.
the is it the emotion or the thought?
Yeah.
And my opinion is that it's the thought, and it may not be a conscious one, but an unconscious thought, a subconscious thought,
Hmm.
something we've picked up. It's some belief that we picked up along about what life ought to be, what certain things mean, and
Yep.
stuff like this. And we've cataloged that somewhere in the past up prior to this, and then something in our exterior environment is a stimuli that goes up against that belief, and then there is an automatic reaction, and
Yes.
an energetic reaction. There is a belief that has been stored, something has been triggered that says, hey, what's in my programming code here says that what's outside there should not be.
Yep.
And so instantly, if this, then that. So I don't know if that's absolutely accurate, but it's been my study. And for me, one of the things that I've been doing as I experience emotional states, instead of immediately trying to repress them or suppress them or all this other stuff,
Yep.
to become aware of them, I have learned to not send that email, to not go and say that thing and do that thing. I've learned to just like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Let's
Slow down
sit with
just a
this for just a
minute.
moment,
Yeah.
and then become a I what I do is I become aware of what I'm feeling, and it's like, and then I ask myself this question: "What would I have to think and or believe to feel this way?"
Yeah.
And for me, there's always been a thought, a belief, or a whole system of thoughts and beliefs that I bullet point down in my journals and stuff like that. It's like, well, of course. Well, every time this would happen, of course I'm going to feel this way.
Yes. Well,
So I don't know if that answers the question, but my experience, my gut feeling is that it's the thought and or belief that may be either conscious or unconscious within us, that once something triggers something on the outside that says this is not how things ought to be, then the emotion is the reaction to that.
yeah. Well, and what I would add to that, I appreciate you for even getting into the question. We can just go so far down the rabbit hole on that one. However, what I would say and add to what you're saying is that, and I made this point, I kind of skipped over it or started to skip over it. Our feelings simply arise, and we do have conditioned patterns. We have patterns from some probably I could make the argument if epigenetics has any truth to it before I was even born and put on this planet as a physical
Yeah.
entity, right? So we do have conditioned patterns. We have things and patterns that we have picked up on that I do think live in our subconscious. That's been my experience. And so anytime that scenario seems to be presenting itself, we do have a default way of reacting to that. Absolutely. And I don't know again where the belief lives. There absolutely has to be a belief in there. And I think it's absolutely true in my experience what you just said. Like what am I believing that's continuing to keep this feeling, this experience going? And that has been very true in my experience, that I can keep anger and sadness and sort of the less than savory emotions, which we'll talk about too, going by just continuing to believe a certain thing and replaying that thought in my head over and over again, that I've been victimized in some way, controlled in some way, manipulated, fill in the blank. So I don't know, but I think the important point that I wanted to make here is that we do have those conditioned patterns and feelings do simply arise. And we don't have to blame ourselves for that. We don't have to blame anybody else for it. And big asterisks here, we can and are probably best served by taking responsibility for them.
So
Probably.
I want to hear more about that, because first
Mhm.
I just want to say that I totally concur on the idea that feelings just arise.
Mhm.
There's no, I'll never, I don't understand the number of people who come to me in a coaching conversation, and we're having a deep, meaningful conversation, and all of a sudden, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cry, and it's like, why are you sorry? Don't apologize,
Because if you cry,
please.
you're weak. That's
But
why.
but it's like, I'm sorry, I should not, just the fact that someone feels the need that they should
Yes.
apologize, that a feeling has arisen,
Yep. We're all a little
there's
codependent.
that at some point, there's some feeling like I should be in control of this,
Yeah.
and we're not, and so I just wanna completely concur.
Yep.
Feelings arise, they
Yes.
come up, we have no control over those chemical reactions in our body.
That's right.
There is nothing to feel ashamed about, guilty about, and there's certainly nothing to apologize about.
That's right.
All right.
Absolutely. Yes.
I wanna hear about your thoughts about taking responsibility for the arising feeling/emotion.
Yeah. So what I'm speaking to there and pointing to is that let's say that, well, let's stay on the thread of the person crying, right? So, we're together, water starts coming out of my eyes. I'm having this experience. And then the next words out of my mouth are, I'm so sorry, Cliff. I'm taking more than my responsibility now for your experience.
Mm,
So I've left my world, my experience over here. I'm now in your world and I'm going to take more than my responsibility. I'd call that taking more than my 100% for what you're experiencing.
yep.
That's an example of too much responsibility.
Ah, so a great pattern interrupt. Oh, thank you so much for protecting me.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great pattern interrupt. I like that.
Now, a way of me taking less than my 100% would be to start blaming you for my sadness. It's
Yeah, you shouldn't
your
have asked me that question.
Yes, you shouldn't have asked me that. Why are you bringing that up? All this is doing is making me upset now, and now I'm sad. So now I'm taking too little, right? And I'm projecting it somewhere else. The sweet spot is to simply be able to be with that experience in the moment as best I can, right? And by the way, I don't want you to mishear me. Maybe me taking responsibility means, oh, I notice I need to take a break. I'm
Yeah.
feeling a bit flooded by this
Yes.
experience, right? So, but my point is that you stay in your experience and you take responsibility for that moment, not getting into somebody else's business about how they feel about what you're feeling and or blaming other people and thinking that other people are causing your experience and taking it out on other people over, what I would call, that's kind of it can be the overreaction, especially when we talk about the experience of anger. I think that's where, the idea of and the experience of overreacting to our anger, in other words, all the way through taking becoming violent towards another human being. That would sort of be the extreme of it, right? Creating tissue damage with another human being because we have experienced anger. But in my world, that's just taking less than 100% and taking it out on someone else, feeling that somebody else has caused you to experience something. So that's the taking responsibility and recognizing that this feeling is arising. No one is actually causing me to feel anything. I take responsibility for that. And at first, that can sound, when I first heard this, I thought it sounded crazy. I'm like, well, if someone calls me a nasty name, of course they're making me feel something.
Mm.
The problem with thinking that way, I think at the core, there's many, but the problem is I don't control what anyone else says or does. So could you imagine if I left it in everyone else's hands, how I was going to feel in a day?
Well, and that goes to the weather. You we were joking about
Yes.
it earlier before we hit the
Yes.
record button, or actually right after we hit the record button. It's the idea is like, hey, just an important note is like, my happiness, my uplifted emotional state is not dependent upon the beautiful, crisp spring weather and sunshiny blue sky.
Yes. And it doesn't mean that I may hang around with somebody who's calling me a lot of nasty names all the time either. I'm responsible for who I want to spend time
So,
with.
Daphne, let me share a story.
Okay.
It came up before, and I kinda just let it flow, and then it came
Okay.
back again. So,
Okay.
I I I had a perfect example of somebody who took responsibility for their emotional state in a early days of Clubhouse. It was matter of fact, this was my very first ever Clubhouse experience.
Okay.
Clubhouse was a social audio app that was really popular back in the pandemic. If you look up the app today, what you experience today is nothing like what it was. But anyway,
Okay.
so I get in there, I hosted a room, says, "How may I serve you? Ask me anything." And this dear woman comes into the group and or into the call, and it's just me and her. First person I've ever talked to in a room that I'm hosting.
Okay.
And she tells me about the fact that her father is in hospice and he's unable to talk. He's got a tube down his throat, and that he was supposed to have died within just days of entering hospice, but he'd been in hospice for, I don't know if remember if it was 6 months or 9 months, but it's been for a very long time. And this person revealed to me that I feel ashamed because I go there every day and I just wish he would let go and leave. And there's a whole history of prior abuse and all sorts of other things, but she feels guilty and compelled that she needs to be there for him, and she doesn't know how to handle this mess. And so she's asking me for advice. It's like, how's this for your first clubhouse room, Cliff?
What should I do about my dying father in
Yeah.
hospice? Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
And
It's like,
so
okay.
the thing is, and by the way, halfway through this conversation, there's like 2 other people in the room now, watching or observing our conversation.
Who've come in mid conversation.
Come in pretty much close to the beginning
Okay.
of it, so they've been witnessing the whole thing.
Okay.
So anyway, I share some story about my biological father and how our relationship wasn't great, and how when he died, we were not on good terms, and our our final conversation before that, and how reconciliation happened in a pretty profound, more metaphysical way through a dream thing. And the one thing I asked her, I said, "Do you have a desire to reconcile with your father? Is that any part of you? And if so, do you think it's possible that maybe your father is holding on because he wants to reconcile with you, but he's unable to communicate?" And she goes, "I'd never given that thought before." And I said, "I don't know. I'm not I've never been trained in how to handle any of this stuff, but have you ever thought about asking your dad questions? Can he hear you?" And she says, "Yes." I said, "Have you ever asked him to, like, hold your hand and tap 1 for yes, tap 2 for can he do that?" And she said, "Yes." And so all of this stuff, and then it was actually after that that I told her about my dad. And after I told her about my dad, I asked her, what comes up for you as I share my experience with my dad? She unmutes. She is crying hysterically. And she says, "I'm sorry, Cliff. I am way too emotional right now to continue our conversation. I have to go." And she left the room.
Wow.
It's like that. But that for me is the perfect
Yeah.
take responsibility. This is way too much for me.
Hmm.
And by the way, this we're at like 50 minutes into the conversation, and she just gone. And then
Yeah.
there are 2 people in the room, and I'm like, "I don't know
Okay.
what to do now. This is my first room. Leave." And then I'm like, for the next 2 or 3 days, I'm like, "Oh, I just don't what could I have done different? Did I do anything wrong?" And all this
Hmm.
other stuff. I felt like I should share that story. It felt like the right thing to do. By the way, just to wrap up the story, and about a week and a half later, I got a Facebook message says, "Cliff, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your room. I apologize for leaving so abruptly and not giving you a time to respond. I was just very emotionally needed to I couldn't continue to talk. But wow, I sat with my father and I did exactly what you did. We actually have reconciled, and I feel really good." And keep whatever you do, Cliff, keep doing what you're doing. But anyway,
Hmm.
I share that story to share with you somebody who did say, "You know what? I am
Flooded. Yeah.
uncontrollably flooded with
Hmm.
emotion right now. And I am not even going to attempt to continue to try to carry on this conversation. I need to sit with this and I need to process it."
Yeah.
And that's what she said in paraphrased words, and then she left without me having a chance to respond to it. It's like, "Okay, great." It's like, but
Which might have
anyway,
been a little abrupt, but and thankfully, I'll say this, like, it's nice that she did reply back to you later. So
yes.
you kind of did you weren't left sort of with this, like, what is happening for this person? Yeah, but your illustration is great though. This person said, "I need to take a break now."
Yep.
Right? There wasn't any blaming,
None.
"You're making me feel a certain way," or "It's your fault that I'm experiencing this." And that is an example of taking responsibility. So I am talking about that's really what I wanted to get to as well with our feelings, is that there's a benefit to taking responsibility, and understanding that although they do arise, we are well served by taking responsibility for them and recognizing that we can own them in our own way, because it's the get out of jail free card. You're no longer at the behest of what anybody else is doing or saying. You're just not. And it's real freedom in that. If you really want the freedom with your emotions, that's the place to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where did I want to go with this? Okay, so as we start to work with our emotions, and I wanted to give a sort of a general sort of list of 4 or 5 general buckets, because I think being able to identify what we're feeling is the other big piece of this. So anger, fear, joy, sadness, and I would put sexual feelings in there. This is how I was trained when I was going through a lot of my psychology training. Anger, fear, joy, and sadness are sort of 4 big buckets. And then I think putting sexual feelings in there, because those are the ones people really get sideways around and don't want to talk about. and that's where we run into I don't know if you've noticed or not, but a lot of issues in our society because of that or with that. So if we can learn to and understand the sort of nuances of those, like you described, getting certain sensations in your body, you're like, oh, that seemed like fear, but now I'm recognizing that's a form of excitement. Right. So we have the sort of continuum, if you will. So I can be, other words for anger, I can be frustrated, I can be annoyed. Um, you know how I feel about cables. I find,
Cables?
yeah, cables, all the cables on my desk or
Oh,
cable.
yes, that we were talking about, yes. I'm like, "Ah."
I wouldn't say I'm angry about them, slightly annoyed at times. Right.
It's like
So,
Steve Jobs and his things about buttons on an iPhone.
yeah, exactly.
Why is there buttons on this
Why are there
thing?
buttons on this? Who needs buttons? Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, slightly annoyed. So different words, right? I can be nervous. I can be anxious. I can be flustered. I can be. I'm trying to come up with all the different adjectives, but there are thousands of adjectives. As a matter of fact, the more adept, the more words we can sort of learn on these continuums, on this continuum of our emotions, the more adept we actually become at recognizing sort of the nuances of what we feel. Anyway, anger, fear, joy, sadness, sex. So when we know what our body signals are, like what anger feels like, there are typical human patterns that people have. Most people have some feeling with anger, or I'll use sadness, I think it's a good one, of getting sort of that lump in your throat kind of
Yep.
feeling, maybe some heat behind your face. Usually I like the water that can come out of our eyes at times with sadness. So there are some common patterns, but I think it's worthy of for everyone to know what their patterns are with different emotional states and different emotional experiences, rather. And then what that starts so that we can label them for ourselves. And then it is helpful when we talk to the other humans. If I say, hey, I'm feeling anxious, you have some sense of what that might be.
So, something that just came up to me, might be something could be valuable for somebody tuning in. I am a huge fan of AI tools, especially ChatGPT,
Yes.
and I am a huge fan of their paid version, which is like 20 bucks a month. One of the things that just occurred to me is like, "Hey, I just, was exposed to the idea that various different emotional states show up typically with patterns that are common among most humans. I wonder if you could give me a list of 25 emotional states, and then under each of them describe for most people where that shows up in the body. I bet you anything you would have an incredible document, and it would serve you well to learn what some of those things are.
From a robot.
From a rope. I we are not gonna go there, Daphne. There is something more than a robot happening there.
I just knew if I said it, I knew it would I'd have the potential to open a can of worms. I knew it. Ha, 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 ha. I'm like the
Yep,
woodpecker. Yeah,
yep.
Woody Woodpecker. Yes, that is a great idea. And actually, I think it would be a great idea just to put that into GPT and also give me all the words I could use to describe the experience of anger. I wonder how many words I
Oh,
would come up with.
well, hold on. So,
Okay.
go to thework.com.
Oh, yes. Byron Katie. Yes.
Yes, and there's
Yes.
an emotions list.
There you go. There it is.
So, did you say anger?
Yeah.
So here you go.
Okay.
Enraged,
Yes.
malicious,
Right.
infuriated,
Yes.
violent, vindictive, furious, repulsed, seething, scornful, hitting, yelling, revengeful, hostile, insulting, swearing, condemning, offensive, aggressive, bitter, loud, sarcastic, frustrated, resentful, critical, mean, sadistic, spiteful, jealous, short tempered, mad, cross, retaliating, overbearing, incensed,
Oh, I love
upset,
incensed.
yes,
I'm incensed.
irritated, controlling, agitated, antagonistic, I don't reprimanding, there it is,
Okay.
envious, reactive, abrupt, quarrelsome,
Oh.
stubborn, rebellious, exasperated, impatient,
I love it.
contrary, disrespectful, unpleasant, annoyed, uh, let's see here, dictatorial, sharp, and snapping, and it does not have perturbed, and that perturbs me.
Oh, perturbed's not on there. That's a good one too. I really what did I like? Quarrelsome. I also
Yeah.
like cross. I'm experiencing a bit of crossness. I feel British when I say that.
Anyway, so yeah,
Yeah.
if you go
Yeah,
to
thework.com.
yeah,
Okay.
the work.com, click on the resources tab, downloadable resources, and there's an emotions list. It's a PDF. It's got the more positive emotions with all of those, and then there's one of the not so positive emotions.
The less than savory ones. Yes. And this is what I also want to hold as true too. They're all enjoyable actually.
They're
When
all good.
they're all
All
good. When you
emotions are good.
Yeah, when you really learn, we've sort of talked about like the positive and negative ones. There's a philosopher I love, Martha Nussbaum, who wrote a whole book on anger, and she would posit that although the experience arises, it's not the healthiest of emotions. And I think, and I agree with her in that, you know, depending on how we work with it, it can become a real drag. But I think all emotions can. I even used, my enthusiasm and joy. This is many, 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 many years ago, but it was on my earlier part of my path. I was on a silent meditation retreat, and you would get a moment to meet with one of the teachers during the week, so you could, at least for 10 minutes, talk to someone. If you felt like you needed to, and you could ask questions. And so I remember meeting with this guy. He was so fantastic, and he said, there may be something you might want to consider with some balance. And that's all he said. Like, balance, like in my life, balance. And so I went back to my room. I mean, you didn't journal, you didn't do anything. I mean, there was nothing. There's no electronics. You're either in your room and you're meditating, or you're on a walk, or that's it. And so I was in my room and I was thinking, I'm like, balance. That's all he said. Balance, balance. And then I realized what he was talking about was equanimity. So balance in my emotion. I had a lot of access to joy and enthusiasm, which was great. But I think what he was able to pick up on is that it felt a bit out of balance. There was something that felt a little off in that way. And so I really sat with that, and I asked myself, what is the thing that you like, where you're not finding this balance? Like, what is it? And I mean, it came to me like effortlessly, that I couldn't be with sadness. I couldn't be with the opposite, what I put in the bucket of opposite. I don't know if it's opposite, but kind of put it in that opposite energy flow of like, oh, so without having some balance in those energies, or the ability to access all of them, I was missing out on a lot of things actually, right, in the experience of living. And that was becoming a detriment, because what it also meant, Cliff, was that I wasn't able to be with other people's sadness because I couldn't be with my own. So when you talked about
Mm.
that example you gave of somebody apologizing, when we look at being with other people's emotions, if we can't be with our own, it's almost impossible to be with somebody else. And that's where we get some of these reactions of like, don't, stop your crying. You're making me uncomfortable. I'm actually not that worried about your well-being. I want to stop feeling uncomfortable. I want to stop feeling what I'm feeling as I watch you struggle. And that becomes a real problem, because now I'm in your business and no longer in mine, and has a lot of detriment. So as we talk about being with these experiences, and we start moving through those, I think this becomes really important too. What is it that we resist? What is it that we don't want to be with? And they're all very enjoyable. When you let go of the judgment and the stories you have about them, all of these feelings and sensations are actually amazing. They're wonderful.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
I love the concept that all experience of life, if allowed, can be enjoyable.
Yes.
So I love that. There are two things that came up for me as you were going, and the first one is about balance.
Yeah.
There's something that I've heard. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't like to point out people that I have some level of disagreement with or resistance to a core teaching of theirs. And who knows? I could be wrong, but I still have a level of resistance to it. So there's a particular teacher out there that consistently shares that emotions should be 50-50. that you should, if you're going to feel positive emotions and blah 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 and all this other stuff, then you should about 50% of your life sit with the negative.
Hmm.
And it's a teaching is like, I'm like, okay, certainly it's like I listen to this podcast and I'm like, okay, I don't like what's being said here. It doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't sit well with me. There's a number of reasons why I wouldn't want 50% of my life to be down here at this low level of consciousness. That just doesn't sit with me.
Hmm.
I'm okay with an experience of guilt and shame, a little bit of anxiety and fear and worry, a little bit of grief in certain situations and circumstances. I'm okay with that. I can appreciate them and I can even experience them as good. In
Yeah. When you let go of the judgment about them, there is no, I
right.
mean, that's kind of what I'm saying.
Yeah, but
Understand.
for me to think that I should somehow feel sad and angry and worried and those
Like you
and
should make yourself feel those things.
not that you should make yourself, but but basically the teaching was in this episode was emotions are 50-50. They're gonna 50% of your experience of life is going to be on the positive, and 50% will be in what you defined as the negative. And as the sooner you come to terms with that, the more you'll be able to deal with and experience life in a positive way. And it's like I just can't sit with the idea that 50% is down here.
Yeah, I can't
It's
either.
like so and I'm like, "Okay, maybe it was just one episode." So by the way, I hadn't listened to this podcast. I listened to this podcast when it first got started, and then I stopped for a while, and then about 2 or 3 years later, I listened to one episode, and it's this teaching, right? And then I'm like, "Yep, I can't. I'm not listening. That doesn't resonate with me." And she was so emphatic about it. And
Yeah,
so
interesting.
I went, and then a couple years later, I keep hearing some of my clients talk. It's like, yeah, I really listen to such and such, and I really get so much, and I'm a part of this program and that program and stuff. It's like, oh, I should go check out that podcast again, give it another shot. And it's like the very next episode is like it was still on this 50-50 thing. It's like here are the top 5 core foundational things that you must understand to experience a good life. And one of her 5 was this. And I'm like,
Oh.
unsubscribe.
Well, we do need to be mindful. I don't know what this person's saying. I will say this about being prescriptive.
Yep.
And even I am do my best to be very sensitive to this. And I would say this about our show. I have no idea what's going to work for anyone.
Right.
I speak from, science to some degree. I do have a background in psychology. I do have a background in coaching. I mean, I do speak from what I know and I speak from my own life experience. But to become prescriptive is a real dicey thing. I mean, I don't know that it's a great idea. And they can't even get it right with medicines. So, take it for what it's worth. I mean, we do our best, right? So yeah, I don't know about,
So
but what I will say that teacher was pointing to though, and I didn't think he was wrong, in my experience as I sat with it. And I don't even know if he knew what he meant. Who knows? He never finished, that was all he said. Um, what I do think was true for me though is that I did resist my own experience and therefore I would be resistive with other people as I would sit with them. If someone did start crying, I would become so uncomfortable. All I wanted them to do was stop crying. And that was really what was of important to me. So call it balance, call it whatever you want. And then I learned a lot more about equanimity and coming to perspectives with a balance, coming to situations with a balanced perspective.
yeah.
That was a real eye opener for me, right? I don't know if this is going to be good or bad because I don't know what's going to be like 3 years from now. I know that I have a preference, but I really don't know beyond that. So, that was more of the mindfulness work that I started doing at the time
I
too.
I've determined that I am not a great judgment or a judge of what is good and what is bad.
Yeah, me either. Who knows?
Because there are so many things that I've experienced in my past that I had labeled as bad, and
Me too.
I held you. We didn't talk about the cognitive emotional loop, yet,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I would experience the thoughts related to a situation, I would assign meaning to it, and
Yep.
then that meaning led to certain emotions that are felt in my body, and I was on a loop. And I will tell you, there have been some experience that I labeled as like, "This is terrible. This is horrible. I can't believe this.
Yeah.
I've been totally disrespected. This person is disloyal. This how could I feel like a victim here?" All this, and I was angry for weeks.
Yeah. For weeks. Exactly. I mean, that you
And
just described the cognitive
hold,
emotional loop. That's it.
yeah, hold on. So hold on though. Now,
And then
this situation occurred 6 years ago, and it's probably one of the top 5 or at least in the top 10 best things that's ever happened in my life.
isn't that great? I know
Yes.
Byron Katie says this too. I could just come back to her work so much. She's like, if someone doesn't call you or someone doesn't invite you, you've just been spared.
Yes.
She's never wrong. So far in my life, that's never not been true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we really don't know. Again, I'm willing to admit when I have preferences,
Yep.
like, oh man, I wish that would have happened as far as I can tell, but I'm never really that attached to it because I don't know what I don't know 6 months from now. I have no idea. And again, this is, I want to get to sort of working with our emotions, and we might just have to do a second show on this because I think, this is where the cognitive part starts to come into our skill, how skillful we are with our cognitive part, with working with our beliefs, with working with our mind stuff that can allow us to be with our emotions and then stop what you just described, Cliff, that unhealthy sort of cognitive emotional loop that gets going. And I think sometimes, what I was really standing for here in the show is learning to be with emotional energy first before we jump. I'm saying it sort of like we jump too quickly to just talking ourselves out of feeling something because we're uncomfortable and we don't want to be with those sensations.
I have a
Yeah.
proposal. Why don't
Okay.
we say that this is part 1 of this
Okay.
topic, and
Okay.
next week is part 2? But I'd love to hear before we end today, what does it mean for you to sit with your emotion, to allow it?
Yeah. Great question. It's very well, let me say it. I'm going to say it's simple. It's not easy in a sense at first. It is now. I don't really have much that goes on, in terms of resisting emotion. In the early stages, sometimes it would require, there were different things. One would be journaling. I would journal. So I was in a pattern at one point in my life, Cliff, where I'm like, the only way that I can work with my emotional energy in a healthy way is to stop what I'm doing right in that moment and go write something. For example, I did not work well with my anger energy. It would come out all over the place, which wasn't great. And very low levels of responsibility.
You know
So,
what, really,
learning.
when you feel that, it just if you just open up your text message app and just start texting people,
Oh, yeah. Fire off some
it
emails.
really allows the anger to flow through you.
It really gets rid of it. It doesn't actually, by the way. If you're a person who's ever taken your anger out on another person, it doesn't do any good.
Ah.
Yeah, exactly. So I would just stop myself. Like I would grab any piece of paper that I had in the I can remember doing this on sticky notes, right? And I would just let myself journal. So it was a way of working with it. And the beauty of that was that I could see I could go back and read it, and it was almost like I'd have this moment of like, you sound kind of crazy, like in a loving way, not in a judgy way, but I could just see these patterns. So that was one part of it. The second part of it was learning to breathe.
Yes.
So with emotions that we resist, whether it's sadness, anger, sexual feelings are a big one. If we can learn to, and this took me a minute, learn to notice the sensation. I didn't even get into labeling them that much at first. I would just notice the sensation and allow myself to breathe, that because usually when we resist something, our breath stops or our breath becomes very short. We're in a reactive state. So it becomes very short and very shallow. So if I could just learn to inhale and exhale, and now this was 15 years ago. So, now they've come up with there's 4x4 breathing, they have all these like cool names for it. But if you can learn to do, inhale for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, and just allow the sensations to be as they are, then the energies really move. Now, this is why we do need to do a part 2, because I can sit with that and allow it, but boy, this thing can start pretty quick, right? And I
When
call
you
it the
when this thing, so for the audio listeners, what is this
yeah.
thing?
This thing is the chirping in your head, and I'm using my hands to sort of make like this beak.
Yeah.
I call it the chirping. It will start. What you described, Cliff, sort of that in that one of your illustrations of like, boy, I've been disrespected and I've been judged, that will start pretty quickly. And what I noticed for myself was it was there were gradations of it, right? So there were little things, and then there were sort of the big things, which were probably the bigger patterns, in my life, right? They were bigger, deeper, more deeply conditioned patterns, probably. So I just learned to, like, how do I breathe with this? How do I allow this to be here? And I think this is the second part of our conversation, because again, I'm talking about it like I mean, it is simple in practice. It's sometimes not easy. And that's where we're dealing with sort of that cognitive part of us, our conditioning, and all these sorts of things that think that the pattern we're experiencing in the moment isn't from before, right? Or the thing that we're experiencing in the moment isn't from before. It feels like, oh, this is new. And what I started to discover, there were a lot of just old patterns in there that really
Yeah.
had nothing to do with the scenario at hand. Yeah.
I
Living in
love that.
presence. Yeah. Yeah. So
Hey,
there are a lot. So I just want to say there are a lot of ways of working with emotion that we can get into in, part 2. Yeah.
I love that. And as you were talking about the chirping in your head, it immediately made me think of Michael Singer's book, Untethered Soul. Have you read that book?
Yeah. Oh, several
He talks
times.
about the roommate.
Yes, the roommate. Yes, your
The
crazy roommate.
roommate.
That's what I
Your
call it.
crazy
Yeah.
roommate.
Crazy roommate. Yeah, she's just up there, just
Living rent free.
taking up space. Yeah. And we have this the other way I've talked about it too is it's almost like I have a crew, but I would prefer to be the captain. I don't want the crew driving the ship. Yeah. So that's going to be part 2. And I know you have a lot to
Ah,
say on this, and which will be really helpful. So,
I
yes.
love
All
it.
right. Yeah.
Call
Thank
to
you.
action.
Call to action. I wanted to today talk about my book. So maybe people know or don't know, I am a published author. And so there is my book. You can go to Amazon and get it. It's Waking Up a Leader. So Waking Up a Leader. You can go to my website and follow the link there as well, daphne-scott.com. But Waking Up a Leader, it is a book that the first half of the book is all about the stuff we were just talking about. It's all about mindfulness and our approach. And then the second half of the book, the title of the book is Waking Up a Leader, the 5 relationships of success. And the second half of the book is really about 5 key relationships that we have in our life. When I asked people what they thought those relationships were, that was really great. They'd say, "You like with your accountant?" No, but maybe. No, the relationships, how we relate to money, how we relate to time, how we relate to friendship. So that would be probably more relational in that way. And so the second half of the book is all about those relationships, and the whole book comes together to bring mindfulness and our approach and consciousness work to these relationships. So there's a lot of exercises in the book. You'll learn a little bit more about me in the book, but I wanted to highlight that today. So Waking Up a Leader, the 5 relationships of success.
Also available on Audible.
Yes, it is on Audible. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Sweet.
Yeah.
And my call to action is if you are experiencing some emotions as it relates to your personal and or professional life, and you're on the seems like the up and down way more than you would like to be, and you'd like to experience a little bit more equanimity, get
That's nice.
clarity about some of your next steps, I'm available for one-on-one coaching. You can email me, cliff@cliffravenscraft.com. Just put coaching in the subject line. I'd love to hear from you.
I love it. Highly recommend it.
Daphne, I still feel good.
I mean, it just gets better every minute.
It does.
It does.
And I'm looking forward to next week when we'll start talking about how uh, to sit with emotions, process them, and then
Yes,
how to experience shifts if we choose to do so, and maybe even how to change some of our beliefs so that what arises in the future might be different than what automatically arises for us today.
I love it. That you just outlined next week's show.
There
Perfect.
you go. Until next time, we encourage you to choose your own adventure.